The mountains held their secrets close, rising like dark walls against the sky, their slopes heavy with pines that whispered when the wind pushed through. Down in the hollow, the Harwick farm clung to the land like something half alive, its fields thin and stony, its cabins weathered gray. Smoke curled lazy from the chimney even in summer, for the Harwicks burned wood not just to cook, but to keep the damp away. And the smell of smoke seemed stitched into every board and every rag they owned. To strangers, if any ever wandered that far, it might have looked almost ordinary. A big house leaning on its porch posts, a barn sagging under the weight of its own years, and the low cabins of those who labored without choice. But no strangers came often, for the road bent away long before the valley, and those who asked about it in town were told the same thing. Stay clear of Hungry Valley. Nothing good waits there. The Harwicks had carved out their place by force, dragging enslaved men and women with them into the mountains where escape was almost impossible. The river cut deep, the forest stretched endless, and the ridges rose sharp enough to tear shoes and shred hope. When snow came down, it buried everything in silence, and the only warmth came from fire or from the smokehouse where meat hung in long rows, drying into the taste of survival. For the Harwicks, that smokehouse was life. For the ones who served them, it was fear. Samuel worked with wood, shaping boards with steady hands, his back bent but his mind sharp. He fixed what broke and built what was demanded, and in the stillness of nights, he carved pieces too small for anyone to notice, scraps that might one day fit together. Ruth moved like shadow between kitchen and field, her eyes catching everything, her silence carrying more weight than words. Their children knew how to listen more than they spoke, and the younger ones learned to read the moods of the Harwicks the way other children learned their letters. Joshua swung his hammer against iron, sparks lighting his dark face in the forge, and Thomas carried burdens without complaint, his strength the kind that did not show until it was needed. 6 souls bound to the Harwicks, 6 souls who dreamed of air beyond the ridges. The Harwicks themselves ruled with fear, sharpened into habit. Marcus, the father, heavy-shouldered and cruel, believed the land and the people on it were his to shape. Eleanor, his wife, sharper than him in cruelty, never moved without the glint of her butcher's knife close by. Their sons, David, William, and James, learned early to see the enslaved as tools, and their laughter carried meaning even in small things. Together they kept the valley closed like a fist, nothing slipping through without their knowing. The smokehouse stood at the edge of the yard, logs darkened by years of fire, iron hooks gleaming when the sun caught them. To the Harwicks, it meant food salted and safe through winter. To the enslaved, it meant punishment. For more than once, a body had been dragged inside not for meat, but for pain. Eleanor said the smoke kept secrets, that it swallowed screams before they could carry. The smell of meat and ash never left the air around it, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin. For those forced to walk past, it was a reminder that nothing in Hungry Valley came without a price. The valley itself seemed cursed with hunger. Crops failed more than they thrived. Corn drying half-formed on its stalks, beans blackened before picking. Wild game was scarce, deer moving higher into ridges where only the desperate followed. Winters bit deep, taking animals and sometimes people, the ground too hard to dig graves until thaw. Yet the Harwicks stayed, their grip tightening as though to leave would mean defeat. And the 6 who labored under them had no choice but to endure, their days measured by lash, by frost, by the dull ache of emptiness in their stomachs. Stories drifted through the trees, carried from Cherokee who once hunted there, of a place where hunger lived like a spirit, devouring all who settled too long. They said the land was cursed, that those who stayed would either starve or turn on each other. The Harwicks laughed when they heard such tales, but the enslaved listened and remembered. Samuel especially kept the story close, for in it he heard not just warning but promise. If the valley devoured all who came, then perhaps one day it might devour the Harwicks too. By lamplight in their cabin, Samuel's hands worked over scraps of wood, shaping small pieces with care. Ruth leaned close, whispering what she had overheard. When Marcus planned to trade, when Eleanor counted her jars, when the sons quarreled. The children listened with wide eyes, memorizing paths, sounds, habits. Nothing was said outright, but everything was understood. They lived under chains, yet chains rusted with time, and rust could be broken. Still, every day dragged long, and the smokehouse sent up its thin gray signal, marking time. Hunger made thoughts sharp, made plans burn hotter than fire. But fear sat heavy too, for in Hungry Valley, mistakes were not forgiven. The land waited, silent and patient, as if it already knew the shape of what was coming. And when the first cold wind of winter blew down through the ridges, rattling the cabins and pushing smoke low across the fields, it carried with it a truth the Harwicks had forgotten. Hunger does not only eat the weak. It feeds on all flesh, and sometimes it chooses its own. The sun rose late in the valley, climbing slow over the ridges, its light caught in the mist that hung heavy between the trees. On most mornings, the farm stirred before it broke the horizon. The sound of boots on frozen ground, the sharp crack of a whip across silence, the low voices of those forced awake to labor while the sky was still gray. The Harwicks moved among them like lords of a kingdom no one else wanted. Their presence carried not by grandeur, but by the constant threat of violence. Marcus led with fists and rope, a man who believed pain was the only language worth speaking. His word was final, and when he barked a command, no one dared pause before obeying. He had a way of staring that seemed to strip away hope, as though he saw not people but tools waiting to break. His shoulders were broad from years of chopping and hauling, and his voice carried like iron striking stone. When his temper rose, which was often, his strikes came down heavy, leaving marks that lingered long after the sting had faded. Eleanor was smaller in frame but sharper in every way, her cruelty quick and deliberate. She rarely raised her voice, but her knife spoke where she did not, glinting in lamplight, slicing meat with the same precision she turned on the enslaved. She inspected their work with a cold eye, noting every flaw, every delay, every stumble of a hand too tired to hold steady. She cut not only flesh but pride, twisting words into wounds that ached deeper than bruises. If Marcus was the storm, Eleanor was the frost that lingered after, chilling everything it touched. The sons had grown in the shadow of this rule. David, the eldest, mirrored his father's hardness, striking quick and often, eager to prove himself the same breed of master. William carried cruelty with a careless air, laughing as he ordered tasks impossible to finish, his amusement drawn from failure he himself had designed. James, the youngest, followed with a mean eagerness, his youth sharpened into spite. Together they moved like wolves, circling, snapping, testing limits they already knew had no defense. Their power was borrowed from their parents, but their hunger to use it was entirely their own. For the 6 who lived under them, every day became a calculation of survival. Samuel bent over his workbench, steadying his hands even when his back screamed, for to falter meant lash or worse. Ruth kept her silence, watching, listening, gathering small pieces of knowledge that could one day matter. Joshua struck his hammer against iron, each spark a reminder that fire could destroy as well as forge. Thomas carried burdens until his shoulders burned, swallowing groans so no one would hear. The children learned early that tears solved nothing, that silence was safer than truth. Meals were thin, bowls of corn mush that filled the stomach without strength. Sometimes a scrap of salted meat found its way into the pot, but more often the smokehouse hung full while the cabins emptied with hunger. The enslaved smelled it day after day, rich and sharp, yet never tasted more than crumbs. Eleanor said it was not for them, that to feed them too well was to spoil them, as if human beings could be measured like livestock. The scent became another chain, a reminder of plenty always out of reach. The smokehouse itself stood as a shadow in their minds. It was not just a place of storage but of punishment. Those who crossed the Harwicks too openly were dragged there, shut inside with the fire and smoke until their screams weakened into coughs. The walls seemed to absorb those cries, holding them so that even when the door opened again, the echo stayed. Passing by, Samuel often wondered how many souls the logs had trapped, how many secrets lay in the blackened wood. The others walked past with lowered eyes, for to look too long was to feel its grip. Fear was not only in punishments, but in small daily reminders. A rope left coiled near the door, a whip hung loose on a peg, Eleanor's knife resting in plain sight on the table. The Harwicks made sure nothing could be forgotten, their power written into every corner. Even the land seemed to bend toward them, the cabins tilting as though bowing, the fields stretched wide yet always hungry. To live in Hungry Valley was to breathe in fear with every lungful of air, to carry it in the bones until it became part of the body itself. Yet beneath that weight something else stirred. Samuel's hands, though steady, held more than obedience. Ruth's silence was not emptiness but gathering. Joshua's sparks carried more than light. Thomas's strength was not only submission. Even the children's wide eyes hid thoughts sharper than the Harwicks imagined. Fear ruled the valley, but fear, like hunger, could change shape. It could turn to rage, to resolve, to something stronger than chains. The Harwicks did not see it. They believed their rule unshaken, their power endless, their cruelty eternal. They moved through the farm certain of their dominion, blind to the truth growing quiet in the shadows. In Hungry Valley, even fear had limits, and the Harwicks were closer to reaching them than they would ever know. The days shortened as autumn sank deeper into the valley, the light fading quicker each evening, the chill creeping under doors and into bones. Smoke hung heavy, clinging low to the ground, as though the air itself carried warning. Work did not lessen with the season. If anything, it grew harsher. Wood had to be stacked higher, corn husked and stored, hogs slaughtered before the frost closed its grip. The Harwicks drove harder, shouting, striking, pushing, their cruelty sharpened by the cold that reminded them how much they depended on the hands they owned. In the cabins, the enslaved gathered their strength quietly. Samuel carved at scraps when no one watched, pieces small enough to seem useless, but each carrying shape and purpose. Ruth kept count of jars and sacks, whispering what she saw as she passed through kitchens and storerooms. Joshua noted the tools left idle, the iron bars, the nails scattered in corners, all things that might serve another use. Thomas saved bits of cloth, cord, and metal as though scraps themselves could be turned into escape. The children traced paths with their fingers on the dirt floor, marking where boards creaked, where shadows fell deepest, where doors opened slow. It was a map born not of paper but of memory, of whispered notes and quiet glances, of patience bound with hunger. It was a dream made real in silence, one piece at a time. But silence has cracks, and even the most careful hands can slip. Eleanor moved like a blade through the house, her eyes sharp, her ears sharper. One night she entered the cabin unannounced, the door swinging wide on its hinges. The lamplight fell across Samuel's bench, catching the small carvings before they could be swept away. She lifted one between her fingers, turning it in the light, her lips tightening. To her, it looked like nothing more than a scrap of wood shaped wrong, but suspicion had long been her nature. She pressed harder, rummaging through what Samuel had hidden, until the pieces began to form something larger. It was not a perfect map, but it was enough. She saw paths scratched, turns marked, lines that led from cabin to barn to smokehouse and beyond. She saw intent, and her breath drew sharp as though the wood itself had struck her. Her voice rose high, calling Marcus, calling the sons, her cry carrying through the valley like a crow's caw. The family gathered, the pieces laid bare on the table, the meaning plain though none wanted to admit it at first. Marcus slammed his fist against the wood, his face flushed dark. David spat curses, pacing back and forth. William laughed, though the sound was thin, unease threaded through it. James asked questions too quickly, betraying his fear. Eleanor stood silent, her knife resting flat against her palm, her eyes never leaving Samuel's face. They dragged him forward, demanding truth, demanding answers he would not give. His silence enraged them more than confession would have. Marcus declared that Samuel would not see another dawn, that he would hang from the rafters of the smokehouse where all could witness what came of defiance. The sons cheered the thought, eager for blood, eager to watch him struggle. Eleanor only smiled thinly, her knife turning slow between her fingers, the edge catching lamplight. The decision was made before the others could speak, before the children could cry out, before Ruth could gather her breath. The smokehouse would be his grave, his body left swinging among the hooks where meat hung. It would be a lesson carved into bone, a warning no one could forget. That night the cabins were heavy with silence. The fire burned low, shadows stretched long, the air pressing tight around them. Ruth sat with her hands folded, her face unreadable, but her eyes shone with fire held deep. Joshua clenched his jaw, sparks of rage flashing behind his stillness. Thomas stared at the wall, his fists tight at his sides. The children lay close, their hearts racing too fast to allow sleep. Samuel sat with them, his hands resting on his knees, his breath steady though his fate was sealed. Through the thin walls, voices carried. The Harwicks spoke of ropes and hooks, of fire and smoke, of punishment fit to break any thought of rebellion. Eleanor's laughter slid through the dark like a blade, cold and sure. Samuel listened, his face calm, but inside a storm gathered. He knew there was no mercy to hope for, no escape if he waited. The only choice left was action. The night deepened, the wind pressing against the walls, the valley holding its breath. In the cabin, whispers began to rise, soft and low, threads of sound weaving into resolve. Plans were reshaped, risks embraced, fear transformed into fuel. The map had been found, the secret torn open, but the meaning of it had not died. It had only changed. The Harwicks believed they had uncovered betrayal, that they had crushed resistance before it could bloom. What they did not see was that by choosing the smokehouse, they had chosen the place where fear would turn back upon them. They had chosen the ground where the balance of power would shift. The dark heart of the valley, where smoke swallowed cries and secrets alike. Outside, the moon slipped behind clouds and the night grew darker still. In the cabin, 6 souls waited with eyes wide open, each breath drawn heavy with what was to come. The valley lay silent, but silence in Hungry Valley was never empty. It was only the pause before the first sound of reckoning. The night chosen was cold enough that frost silvered the edges of the fields, the earth stiff underfoot, the stars clear above the ridges. The cabins lay quiet, yet no one inside slept. Samuel rose with a calm that belied the storm in his chest, his eyes meeting Ruth's for a long moment, their silence saying what words could not. The children clung to one another, their faces pale in the dim firelight. Joshua's jaw was set, Thomas's broad shoulders tense, their breath slow and deliberate. Together they moved like shadows pulled from the dark, silent in their resolve, the weight of decision heavy but unshakable. Eleanor was the first to stir that night in the big house. She trusted no one, not even in sleep, her mind restless, her ears sharp. She carried her knife as she stepped outside, the blade flashing when moonlight touched it. She headed toward the smokehouse, suspicion her constant companion, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The fire within still glowed faint, the smell of meat and ash thick in the air, smoke curling lazily into the night. To Eleanor, it was a place of control, a place where she commanded fear. She had no reason to think the smokehouse might swallow her instead. Samuel waited in the shadows by the door, his breath clouding faintly. The others circled near, hearts pounding like drums. When Eleanor pushed open the door, its hinges groaned, the sound swallowed quickly by the thick smoke inside. She stepped into the dim glow, her knife loose in her hand, her gaze sweeping across the racks of hanging meat. She did not see Samuel move until it was too late. He struck with the force of desperation, seizing her arm, twisting the knife away. She gasped, her breath sharp, but the sound cut short as his hand closed around her throat. Her eyes flared wide, fury and disbelief mingling with fear. Joshua was there in a breath, Thomas close behind, their weight pressing her down. The struggle was fierce, her nails clawing, her body thrashing, but the years of power she had held could not save her against the strength of 3 determined souls. Ruth appeared at the doorway, her face pale but steady, her voice low, urging them on when hesitation flickered. The smokehouse filled with harsh sounds, boots scuffing against dirt, the rasp of labored breathing, the scrape of hooks swaying against chains. Eleanor's knife clattered across the floor, spinning out of reach. Her cries were muffled into Samuel's grip, swallowed by the very smoke she had trusted to hide so many others' pain. For the first time, the walls held her voice. The firelight danced across her face as terror stripped away her poise. They dragged her against the table, her body forced flat, arms pinned. Eleanor kicked, twisted, cursed with a venom that would have stung if fear had not already smothered her power. Joshua lifted one of the iron hooks, the metal glinting dull in the smoke. Thomas held her down with the strength of rage long buried. Ruth stepped forward, her hand closing around the knife Eleanor had lost, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. For a moment the air seemed to still, as though the valley itself leaned in to witness. Samuel's voice broke the silence, low and steady. He spoke not in anger, but in truth, reminding them of the scars she had left, the hunger she had inflicted, the nights she had stolen. His words carried weight, pressing down heavier than the hands that restrained her. Eleanor's face changed as she heard him, her defiance slipping, fear shining clear. She understood then that the rule she had wielded had reached its end. The blade moved, swift and sure. Her scream cut short, swallowed into smoke and night. Blood ran hot, hissing as it struck the coals, its scent twisting with the smell of burning wood. The room filled with the sharp tang of iron, the fire flaring as if in answer. Eleanor's body shuddered, then stilled, her eyes wide but empty. Her voice gone forever into the dark walls of the smokehouse. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames and the slow drip of blood onto dirt. The enslaved stood frozen, breath heavy, eyes locked on what they had done. Relief and horror mingled, freedom and fear knotted tight. Ruth's hand shook, yet she did not let go of the knife until Samuel gently took it from her. Joshua set down the hook, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. Thomas wiped his hands against his shirt, though the stains did not fade. The children, peering from the doorway, watched with wide eyes, their innocence gone in a single night. They worked quickly then, not out of panic, but necessity. The body was stripped, divided, handled with the same care Eleanor herself had once shown when preparing meat. It was grim, it was unthinkable, yet it was survival and vengeance woven into one act. The hooks bore her weight, the fire preserved her flesh, the smoke curled higher as though carrying her cruelty away in black threads. The woman who had starved them, beaten them, cut them, was reduced to the very thing she had denied them most. By dawn, the smokehouse no longer belonged to Eleanor. It stood claimed by those she had tried to break, its air thick with a new power. The valley lay hushed, the frost melted where blood had touched, the trees still in their witness. Samuel and the others stepped out into the gray light, their faces drawn but their backs straighter than they had ever been. For the first time, the balance had shifted. The Harwicks slept in their house unaware, their dreams untouched by the absence already taking root. They would wake to breakfast, expecting the same order, the same rule, the same fear. But fear had turned its face. The valley itself seemed to hold a different breath, the smoke rising darker, thicker, carrying with it the first taste of reckoning. The morning came sharp with wind, the sky pale gray over the ridges, the ground still frozen from the night's deep cold. Inside the Harwick house, Marcus stirred before the others, his body used to the rhythm of work and drink. He noticed first what was missing. No sound of his wife moving about, no scrape of pots, no hum of the old tune she carried through her chores. The house felt strange in its stillness, the hearth low, the halls hushed. He rose with a muttered curse, pulling on boots, certain she had gone to the smokehouse early. The sons woke soon after, groggy, their steps heavy, their talk low. David frowned at the silence, William muttered about the chill in the house, and James stretched, yawning, before realizing something was wrong. For all their suspicions, none imagined the truth waiting in the kitchen. The table was already set. The heavy dishes, the iron pot steaming, the bread warm, the scent of coffee thick in the air. Cornbread cut in neat squares, butter laid out in a small dish, and strips of meat arranged with care on the best plates. The meal looked exactly as Eleanor would have made it, precise in every detail. down to the seasoning she guarded like a secret. Marcus froze in the doorway. His sons followed, their faces shifting from relief to unease. No one had risen to cook, yet here was breakfast, prepared with knowledge only Eleanor possessed. The cornbread carried the faint sweetness she alone added. The coffee held the exact measure of honey Marcus demanded each morning. The meat was cut to portions Eleanor always favored. They sat slowly, suspicion heavy in the air. David examined the food first, his hand cautious as though expecting a trick. James broke a piece of bread and tasted, chewing with growing uncertainty. It was right, every flavor exact, every detail familiar, and yet wrong because it came without her hand. Marcus tasted the meat. The flavor struck him hard, richer, heavier, with a depth no venison or boar had ever carried. He chewed slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing. The sons noticed it too, the strangeness that came with each bite, the tenderness of the flesh, the unusual marbling of fat. It was undeniably better, yet the thought of where it came from twisted their stomachs. The silence stretched long, broken only by the sound of knives on plates, the occasional swallow, the crackle of the fire. William finally spoke, his voice uneasy. "It tastes different." No one answered at first. Marcus stared at the meat, chewing slowly, his brow furrowed. David set down his fork, his appetite gone despite the richness of the food. James laughed nervously, though it died quickly in the heavy air. The unease turned to fear when Marcus rose to check the locks. The doors were fastened from within, the windows unbroken, the horses still in the barn. No one could have come in. No one should have known their routines so perfectly. Yet the breakfast lay before them, as though prepared by invisible hands. The sons exchanged glances, their bravado shaken. They had mocked ghost tales and mountain curses, but the evidence sat on their plates, steaming and real. Marcus cursed under his breath, unwilling to admit fear, but his eyes betrayed him. He felt it too, the sense of being watched, of something shifting within the very walls of his home. Outside, the smoke rose steady from the smokehouse chimney, darker than usual, carrying with it a smell that was familiar yet strange, sharp and heavy, clinging to the air. The valley seemed to lean closer, the trees still, the birds absent, as if the land itself had paused. The meal ended with no satisfaction. The men pushed back from the table, their bellies full yet their minds unsettled. Marcus ordered a search, his voice firm though it cracked at the edges. They split across the property, their boots crunching frozen ground, their eyes darting to shadows. They searched the barns, the sheds, the fields, and the quarters. Nothing explained the breakfast, nothing explained Eleanor's absence. The quarters were empty but not abandoned. The small possessions of the enslaved still lay in place, neatly arranged, as though they had stepped out only for a moment. The fire smoldered low, the bedding still warm. No signs of flight, no struggle, no forced doors. 6 people gone, as though they had dissolved into the mountain air. Back in the house, the dishes remained on the table, crumbs scattered, the pot cooling, the smell of coffee lingering. It all carried her touch, and yet she was nowhere to be found. Marcus stood at the window, staring toward the smokehouse, his jaw tight. The chimney smoke curled high, steady and sure, proof of fires tended with care. His sons joined him, their faces pale. None spoke the thought forming silently between them, the suspicion that chilled deeper than the February air. The food they had eaten was not ordinary, and the hands that prepared it were not meant to be free. Yet the truth pressed close, seeping in like the smoke that clung to their clothes, impossible to ignore. That night, they sat again at the table. Another meal appeared, the bread warm, the meat fresh, the dishes arranged with Eleanor's exact touch. Still, she was gone. Still, the enslaved were gone. Each bite grew heavier, harder to swallow, the flavor rich but tainted with dread. The Harwick men, once masters of their mountain kingdom, found themselves trapped in their own house, their own table turned against them. Every meal became a question, every mouthful a threat. The smokehouse stood silent but alive, its fires burning, its shadows deep. And the mountain seemed to listen, holding the secret of what they had already consumed. The valley grew quieter with each passing day, as though sound itself feared what lingered in the smoke. The Harwick sons no longer strode about the land with the same careless confidence. Their voices dropped low, their steps slowed, their eyes darted at every corner. Marcus held himself upright, barking orders to prove control, but his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. The meals continued to appear, warm and precise, each detail perfect as if Eleanor herself had returned, yet her absence gnawed at them like a worm in wood. They ate less, picking at the food, their suspicion stronger than their hunger, though the taste was still too rich, too compelling, to abandon altogether. The enslaved children were the first to slip from sight. It happened without alarm, without noise, so quietly that at first the Harwicks did not notice. They assumed the little ones remained in the cabins, hidden behind their mothers or slipping through the woods. But the cabins stood empty, the bedding undisturbed, the air stale as though no breath had passed through for days. Marcus stormed through the quarters, calling out names he barely remembered, cursing into silence that gave no answer. Ruth had hidden them well, carrying them into the deeper folds of the valley where the Harwicks dared not follow. The mountains were full of places unknown to the men who claimed to own them, caves that swallowed sound, hollows that held their shadows. The children vanished into those dark places, their small feet guided by hands that knew every path. Samuel and Joshua moved like ghosts, leading them through creek beds and thickets, covering their tracks with the patience of hunters. By the time the Harwicks realized, the young ones were already beyond their reach. In the house, unease turned to anger. David struck the table, demanding searches, demanding torches and dogs. Marcus agreed at first, sending them into the woods, but the dogs refused to track, whining and pulling back, their noses confused by the smoke that hung heavy over everything. The sons returned with scratches and torn clothes, their eyes wide at every sound. They had not found children. They had not found anyone. The woods themselves seemed to push them back. That night, the meal was different. The same careful hands had prepared it. The same cornbread, the same steaming pot, the same meat. But something lingered beneath the flavor, something that caught in their throats and made them pause. The children's absence weighed heavy on their minds, and the thought pressed unspoken between them. Were the little ones hidden, or had they already been fed? William refused to eat, pushing his plate away, his face pale. James tried to laugh, but his voice cracked. David cursed him for weakness and forced down another bite, though his hands trembled. Marcus chewed with his jaw locked tight, swallowing without tasting, his mind racing faster than his words. The food filled their bellies but gave no comfort. Each bite felt stolen, each swallow edged with dread. The nights grew longer, the firelight throwing shadows that seemed to move when no one stirred. Marcus kept watch by the window, his rifle across his knees, though he no longer trusted steel or powder to protect him. The sons argued in whispers, suspicion fraying the bond between them. James accused David of cowardice. David accused William of betrayal. William accused them all of blindness. The walls of the house that once rang with power now echoed with fear, and always, the smokehouse loomed. Its chimney smoked steady day and night, its fire never dimmed, its door always closed. None dared enter, yet each man felt drawn to it, compelled and repelled in equal measure. They could not bring themselves to face what burned within, but they knew it was not empty. The valley itself seemed to shift. The birds that once called at dawn did not return. The creek, once lively with sound, ran low and quiet. Even the trees felt changed, their bare branches twisted against the sky like arms raised in warning. The Harwicks began to feel not like masters of the land, but prisoners of it. When morning came again, the table was set, but smaller. Fewer plates, fewer portions, as though the house itself knew how many mouths remained. The sight froze them where they stood. No one had removed the children's places, yet they were gone all the same. The realization chilled deeper than any winter wind. The household was shrinking, meal by meal, and the hand that prepared the food seemed to count better than they could. Marcus slammed his fist against the table, swearing he would burn the smokehouse to the ground. But even as he said it, his eyes flickered with doubt. The fire within had burned without their tending. The meals had come without their command. Something larger than them had taken root, and fire could not unmake what was already claimed. His words rang hollow, and his sons heard it too. That night sleep did not come. The sons lay restless. Marcus sat rigid in his chair, and outside the smokehouse glowed faint, its chimney whispering into the cold sky. Somewhere in the dark, the children were gone, swallowed by forest or fire. None could say. Only the valley knew, and the valley kept its silence. The walls of the Harwick house, once filled with noise and authority, began to close in like a coffin. The rooms that had echoed with Eleanor's sharp commands and the sons' laughter now carried only silence broken by mutters, arguments, and the occasional crash of a fist against wood. The family ate at a table that grew emptier with each passing day, their plates filled with meals they no longer trusted, their bellies turning even as the taste lingered sweet and heavy on their tongues. David was the first of the sons to unravel. His anger, once sharp and focused, turned wild. He paced the halls at night, muttering curses, jerking awake at the smallest sound. He struck James across the face for whispering too close to the window, struck William for refusing to search the woods again, struck even Marcus when the old man tried to steady him. His eyes carried a fevered gleam, as though he saw more than what was in the room, as though shadows followed him from corner to corner. One morning, he refused to sit at the table, shouting that the food was poisoned, that the meat carried the breath of ghosts. He stormed into the yard with his rifle, firing into the trees until the smoke of his powder joined the darker smoke curling from the smokehouse. James fared little better. His laughter became brittle, bursting out at strange moments, jarring in the silence. He mocked David's paranoia, mocked William's hesitation, mocked Marcus's stiff jaw and trembling hands, but the laughter always ended with his own eyes darting to the kitchen door, to the covered dishes waiting. His jokes died quicker with each day, his voice cracking, his smile faltering, his youth burning away under the weight of fear. William withdrew into himself. He no longer argued, no longer laughed. He moved slow, his face pale, his eyes sinking deeper. At the table, he pushed food from one side of his plate to the other, eating only when Marcus forced him. He spent hours staring at the smokehouse from the window, as though trying to see through its walls. He was the quietest of them, yet his silence carried a gravity that frightened the others more than David's rage or James's madness. Marcus tried to hold them together. He spoke of order, of law, of strength, but the words rang hollow. His sons did not listen the way they once had. His authority had rotted, eaten through by dread. He drank more, clutching the bottle as though it were the last weapon left to him. His eyes grew bloodshot, his shoulders sagged, his voice cracked. Still, he kept his rifle near, as though steel and powder might guard him against the shadows in his own home. The house itself seemed to decay with them. The fires burned too low or flared too high. The walls creaked even when the wind was still. The doors rattled as though something pressed against them from outside. Rats scurried bolder across the floors, their eyes shining in the firelight. The Harwicks shouted and cursed at the vermin, but the creatures would not leave, drawn by the same scent that filled every corner. The smokehouse's breath had seeped into the wood of the house, into the bedding, into the very skin of those who remained, and always the meals came. Each morning, each evening, food appeared as though summoned. The cornbread, the beans, the rich meat cut in careful portions. The smell was irresistible, the taste undeniable, and though suspicion burned in every man, they could not stop. Hunger outweighed fear, even as fear gnawed them hollow. Each swallow carried the weight of Eleanor's voice, of the missing children, of the vanished enslaved. Each bite pressed against the question none dared to speak aloud. What exactly had they eaten, and whose flesh bound them tighter to this table? One night, as the wind howled through the valley, David snapped. He overturned the table, dishes shattering, food scattering across the floor. He shouted that the house was cursed, that Eleanor herself had risen against them, that the enslaved had turned to demons in the smoke. His voice cracked into sobs, rage spilling into tears. Marcus struck him, hard, but David only laughed through the blood on his lip, a wild laugh that chilled the others to stillness. James fell silent after that. No more jokes, no more brittle laughter. He sat in corners, muttering prayers under his breath, the words broken, twisted, half forgotten. William grew paler still, refusing to sleep, his eyes sinking into darkness. Marcus clung to his bottle, his rifle heavy across his knees, his sons unraveling before him like threads cut loose. The valley pressed closer. The trees groaned in the wind. The smokehouse glowed faint, its chimney whispering, its fires endless. No matter how tightly the doors were barred, the Harwicks felt watched, felt surrounded, felt claimed. The walls that had once stood as their fortress now closed around them as a tomb. By the week's end, none of them could tell if it was day or night. The lamps burned always. The fire never dimmed. The windows showed only smoke curling past. Their meals blurred together, the same flavors, the same richness, the same dread. Their bodies grew weaker, their minds more tangled. They were not masters of anything anymore. They were prisoners at their own table, bound by the very food that sustained them, undone by the valley they had once ruled. The final night came without warning, though in truth it had been creeping toward them since the first meal appeared. The air hung heavy, the valley wrapped in a stillness so deep it seemed even the earth held its breath. The smokehouse glowed faint at the edge of sight, its chimney whispering dark threads into the sky. Inside the Harwick home, the last fire burned low, shadows stretching long across the walls, crawling like things alive. The table was set again, though none of the men had moved to prepare it. The dishes sat in their places, the bread cut, the beans steaming, the meat glistening with the sheen of fat that carried a scent both irresistible and dreadful. Each plate bore exactly enough for the mouths left in the house, no more, no less. The sight froze them all, yet hunger pulled them forward, the gnawing ache too strong to ignore. Marcus sat first, his rifle leaning against his chair, his face drawn and gray, the bottle near his hand. He looked older than his years, his shoulders bent, his eyes dulled but burning still with a stubborn spark. David dropped into his seat with a laugh that broke halfway, his fingers twitching, his breath sharp. James slid into place, muttering under his breath, his lips cracked, his eyes darting. William came last, silent as always, his pale face lit by the wavering flame. They sat in their places as though summoned, as though bound by a ritual older than any of them. The food waited, and at last they reached for it. The first bites fell heavy, the flavor rich and thick, the taste unmistakable, undeniable, inescapable. They chewed slowly, their jaws stiff, their eyes unblinking. The silence pressed down, broken only by the scrape of knives, the clink of forks, the sound of swallowing. Each man knew the truth now, though none dared speak it. They had eaten their wife, their mother, their captives, their children. The valley had turned them into cannibals at their own table, and still they ate. David broke first, dropping his fork, laughing until tears cut his face. He shouted that the valley was feasting through them, that the smoke carried their sins higher with every breath. He staggered to his feet, knocking his chair aside, and before Marcus could rise, he drove his own knife into his chest. He fell against the table, blood spilling across the plates, soaking into bread and beans. His laughter died with a gurgle, his eyes staring wide and unseeing. James screamed, a sound high and sharp, scrambling back, his prayers tumbling from his lips in broken fragments. He clawed at the door, pulling at the lock, but the door did not yield. It rattled beneath his hands, but it would not open. He cried out to God, to Eleanor, to anyone listening, but the only answer was the steady crackle of the fire and the dark plume rising from the smokehouse. His voice broke and he fell against the wall, shaking, his body crumpling into silence. William did not move. He sat at the table, staring at the blood spreading across the wood, at the meat cooling on his plate. His hand trembled, but he did not drop his fork. Slowly, mechanically, he lifted another bite to his lips, chewing with a hollow calm. His eyes were empty, his body thin as bone, but he ate as though nothing else remained in him but the act itself. Marcus watched his sons fall, his heart pounding with fury and despair. He rose at last, his rifle in his hands, his voice rising in a roar against the silence. He shouted curses, threats, denials, his words echoing through the house. He swore he would burn the smokehouse, that he would salt the earth, that he would destroy the valley itself. But even as he spoke, the fire flared, the walls groaned, and the smoke thickened. His voice faltered, his arms sagged, and he sank into his chair, his head dropping heavy into his hands. The last meal ended not with fullness, but with collapse. The table sat in ruin, blood mingling with broth, bread scattered across the floor, meat left half-eaten. The fire guttered low, the shadows deepened, the air thick with the scent of smoke and iron. The Harwick name ended there. In the house they had ruled, undone not by blades from without, but by the valley itself, by the reckoning they had sown with years of cruelty. Outside, the smokehouse burned steady, its fire never failing, its chimney breathing dark against the night. From its depths came no screams, no cries, only the endless whisper of flames. In the hollows of the valley, the enslaved who had vanished remained hidden, their faces lit faintly by the glow of distant fire. They had no need to raise arms, no need to storm the house. The land had claimed vengeance for them, and the Harwicks had devoured themselves. By dawn, the house stood silent. The windows dark, the doors closed, the table inside left in ruin. The valley was still, the birds returned to their branches, the creek to its song. The smokehouse alone remained, its fires eternal, its smoke rising into the pale sky like a final mark. Hungry Valley had fed itself, and its hunger was sated at last.